You are listening to Commission 6-8.
It is Monday, September 6th, in the greatest country on earth. I'm your host, Randy Millette, and this is Commission 6-8. Today, we're going to be talking about the government shutdown, the history of funding gaps in the U.S., and as always, we're going to see what the Bible has to say about it. So let's go.
Hello, America. This is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Democrats in Congress have shut down the federal government because they care more about funding health care for illegal immigrants than they care about serving you, the American people.
Republicans have failed to get enough votes to avoid a shutdown. They've got to sit down and negotiate with Democrats to come to a bill that both parties can support.
When Congress decides to turn off the lights, to shut the government down, it shifts the authority to the executive branch. That's how the process works.
I will say, because I saw some senators speculating about this, and I saw some Republican members of Congress saying, oh, well, if we have this shutdown, it's because of AOC. Well, if that's the case, my office is open, and you are free to walk in and negotiate with me directly.
We look forward to hearing from you again very soon. And in the meantime, please know President Trump will never stop fighting for you. Thank you, and God bless you.
Welcome to day 6 of the U.S. government shutdown. That's right, the government is closed for business and has been for the past 6 days. The government is completely shut down, and we have questions. Like, what exactly is a government shutdown? Why is it shut down? Who shut it down? When is it going to reopen? Will it ever reopen? Who can reopen it? What has to happen? What is a CR? Whose fault is it? Who's blaming who? Well, we know the Democrats are blaming the Republicans and vice versa. But I want to start by looking at why exactly does the government shut down? Why does this happen? Every year around this time, we hear words like continuing resolution, appropriations bills, and then a potential looming government shutdown. Usually gets avoided. In this case, it did not. So why does this happen? Well, required by the Constitution, all 3 branches of the federal government are funded through an appropriations process, which originates in the United States Congress. To be exact, it originates in the House. And they fall under the jurisdiction of what's called the Committee on Appropriations, or the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee was founded in 1865, and they were tasked with funding the federal government. Now, because the appropriations process can be a fairly complicated task because the government funds a lot of things, the Appropriations Committee divides its work among 12 subcommittees, each with the responsibility of producing a bill that funds their particular department and areas of government. And like any other bill, the spending measures must pass both the House and the Senate and then be signed by the President to become law. And this has to happen every fiscal year. So the fiscal year of the United States government runs from October 1st to the following September 30th. So by September 30th of the very next year, all of this has to happen again, or the government has the potential to be shut down. It will not be funded. Now, because we know that Congress has a tendency to be wildly inefficient, it is very seldom that October 1st rolls around and the Appropriations Committee has done everything that they need to do, and both the House and the Senate has passed the appropriations bill and sent it to the president to sign, and everything went according to plan. What usually happens is October 1st rolls around, and they did not pass an appropriations bill. So then they have 2 options. The first option is to vote on and pass what's called a continuing resolution, or CR, which would essentially fund the government in the interim while Congress worked on the appropriations bill. And the second option is, you guessed it, a government shutdown. So, as of September 30th, 2025, Congress had not passed an appropriations bill or a continuing resolution, so the government shut down. So what happens during a government shutdown? Well, the first and most glaring pressing thing is that thousands of people are not going to get paid. Those that are not deemed essential workers are furloughed. They don't come to work and they don't get paid. But those that are deemed essential workers, like the military or Border Patrol or ICE, they have to go to work and they still don't get paid. Now, more than likely, once the government reopens, they'll get back pay, And in the past, we have seen workers that were furloughed didn't have to come to work and still got back pay, which, helps out a lot because unlike the federal government, most people budget themselves and try to stay within their budget, and not receiving a paycheck is not something that they counted on. Now, who gets paid during a government shutdown? Well, glad you asked. Congress. Congress actually gets paid. They get paid during a government shutdown. So Congress didn't get their act together, didn't pass a continuing resolution or an appropriations bill, shuts down the government and stops pay for thousands of federal workers, and they continue to get paid. Yeah, that's the thing. This is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt explaining the effects of the current shutdown.
Well, look, this government shutdown is no doubt going to impact everyday Americans, and it is the fault of the Democrats that we are in this position. And I know I relayed some programs that will be impacted. The vice president did as well, but I just want to make sure the American public understand what the Democrats have done to our government and our country. 1.3 million active duty troops will work now without pay. Critical food assistance for low-income women, infants, and children will now lapse. No new mothers or children are allowed to join this critical program because of the Democrats' decision to shut down the government. Telehealth services for seniors and in-home treatment options for Medicare patients will now come to an end. Nearly 50,000 members of the United States Coast Guard are going to have to work unpaid. Over 13,000 air traffic controllers will work without pay, as well as TSA agents, which will very likely create flight disruptions, and pay will now stop for over 150,000 federal law enforcement officers. These are not just numbers and statistics. These are real Americans who have families at home. And I saw some Democrat members today saying they're still going to accept their paychecks because they have 3 kids at home and they have mouths to feed. Well, so do these federal workers who those same Democrats just voted to shut down the government and turn off their pay. And we believe that's very unfair. And it's why the administration wants to see the government reopened.
Now, I can easily do this entire episode on the partisan fighting and the pointing fingers and the blame game and whose fault is it and what do we have to do to get out of this. But you can turn on any news channel at any point in the day and hear all of that. So what I would like to do instead is look back at the history of funding gaps in the government and when those funding gaps contributed to a government shutdown. So from 1976 to 1979, Congress had failed to pass appropriation bills, which resulted in 6 funding gaps, totaling 66 combined days. However, none of these funding gaps caused a government shutdown. The first government shutdown would not occur until 1981, and the name you need to know is Benjamin Civiletti. To help explain this, I'm going to read an article to you from the History, Art, and Archives website at history.house.gov. In 1980 and 1981, United States Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti wrote a series of legal opinions that established a basis for government shutdowns. Civiletti called for a stricter interpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, a long-standing law that prohibits government agencies from authorizing expenditures in excess of the amount Congress provided them by law. Ultimately, the Attorney General believed government agencies had no legal means to operate during a funding gap. Beginning with the appropriations process for fiscal year 1982, many subsequent funding gaps have resulted in a shutdown of affected agencies in which day-to-day operations halt and employees are furloughed without pay. Eventually, federal officials carved out exemptions for government employees deemed essential, like military and law enforcement personnel involved in the protection of life and property. So this was during the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, and Benjamin Civiletti was an attorney general that was left over from Carter's administration, and he essentially wrote the book on government shutdowns. Up until then, any funding gap that occurred, the government just operated knowing that a continuing resolution or another appropriations bill would eventually get passed. But ever since Benjamin Civiletti wrote his opinions, every funding gap in the U.S. government has a potential consequence of a government shutdown. Now, the last thing I want to do before the break is talk about where this leaves us in the event of a government shutdown and Congress can no longer fund federal agencies. And I'm going to replay you a clip. I played this during the intro, but this is Speaker of the House Mike Johnson explaining how the authority shifts from Congress to the executive branch.
When Congress decides to turn off the lights, to shut the government down, it shifts the authority to the executive branch. That's how the process works. The person who has decided to put the White House in that situation is Chuck Schumer, who leads the Democrats, the 44 who keep voting to keep the government from opening up. They're voting to shut it down. So what happens in that situation? Whoever is the president, whoever is sitting in the White House, and their staffs at the Office of Management and Budget are given an unenviable task. It's a regretful situation. They have to then determine, since the spigots have been effectively turned off and there's no more money coming in, they have to then prioritize, triage effectively, federal spending. They have to look at all of that and say, which things are deemed essential and which are non-essential, which priorities, policies, and personnel must be kept to keep the government operating and which are less of a priority.
So just as you heard Speaker Johnson explain, because Congress has not funded the government, the authority has now shifted to the executive branch, who is President Trump. And President Trump has now the power and the authority to cut funding to any government agency that he sees fit without Congress approval. Well, I have a theory. Do you remember at the beginning of his term when he brought in Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and created Doge? And they exposed all kinds of wasteful spending at the expense of the American taxpayer and all kinds of government agencies that were not only not efficient, but they deemed not essential. I'm sure you remember that. However, after that happened, Trump didn't go start slashing all these government agencies like personally I thought he was going to, and obviously Elon Musk thought he was going to as well, because what followed was a big public feud between Trump and Elon Musk. But we still have those Doge reports, and believe me, Trump still knows which government agencies need to be cut. And now, as a result of the Democrats not passing a CR or not passing an appropriations bill, Trump now has the authority to cut anything he wants without Congress approval. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but the stage is definitely set. And all we can do is watch and wait. Regardless, this is a very interesting time, and hopefully I helped demystify some of what's going on with the government shutdown and why they happened in the first place. Now we're going to take a quick break, and after the break, we're going to come back and we're going to open up the Word and see what we can do during this government shutdown and how God miraculously provides.
You are listening to Commission 6-8.
This episode is brought to you by Living Proof Church, a non-denominational, spirit-filled church in Araby, Louisiana. Services are held Sundays at 10 a.m. and live streamed on YouTube. Visit us at livingproof-church.com to plan your visit.
You are listening to Commission 6-8.
In 1 Kings chapter 17, we see Elijah the prophet standing before the king of Israel, King Ahab. And I'm going to read from verse 1. It says, "And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word." So Elijah is speaking to Ahab because God told him to say it, and he says, there's going to be a famine in the land. It's not going to rain. There's not going to be dew on the grass. Food's not going to grow. And this is going to last as long as I say it does. Now, as you continue to read the story, you see that the famine lasted for 3.5 years. But throughout the 3.5 years, God miraculously provided and sustained not only Elijah, but other people that came into contact with Elijah, because God gave him the directive to do so. Now, we know that we put our trust in God. Our provision comes from the Almighty. If we relied on Congress to provide for us, we would live in a perpetual drought, right? The government can't do anything right. but our provision comes from the Lord. Now, Elijah called a famine in Israel because God told him to do so. God called the famine in Israel because of idolatry and idol worship. Ahab allowed altars to be erected in high places, and he allowed idolatry in the land. And the famine lasted until all the idols were overthrown. Now, if we look at the United States, now we are a Christian nation, and I've said in every episode so far that we are on the cusp of a revival, and I truly believe that. God's really moving, especially among the younger generation, but there's still a lot of idol worship. We have set idols above our founding principles. Look at the trans cult, right? The next episode that I'm doing, it was going to be this episode, but with the government shutdown, I slipped this one in. The next episode that I'm doing is going to be on the war against your children. And the trans community is after your children. And America has allowed the trans community to set altars in the high places that go against our founding principles and against God's will for this country. So this government shutdown, I don't think it's going to last 3.5 years. Obviously, I don't think that America's in for a 3.5 year famine and drought. But I do believe that it's a time of reckoning, and I do believe that it's time to tear down these idols. A lot of the funding that Trump wants to cut, a lot of the Doge cuts, the money was being sent to things like USAID and other agencies that are funding this trash, this filth, NPR, funding this filth that's being perpetuated against your children. It's being used. Look at all the celebrities in Hollywood. See, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the next episode. But look at all the celebrities in Hollywood. Almost every one of them have kids that are trans, non-binary, gender dysphoria. It's really mental illness. And the idols that the trans community has set in the high places in this country, it's time for them to come down. And now is the time. This is the turning point. This is the time that we're tearing them down. And I hope Trump follows through with these Doge cuts, and I hope he starts eliminating these agencies that are allowing this idolatry to take place. Now, the word says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. And we as Christians, we need to be the gatekeepers, not just for our children and our personal lives, but for our country. Now, the drought in Israel ended with Elijah's standoff with the prophets of Baal. When he instructed the prophets of Baal to sacrifice to Baal and have Baal rain down fire on the sacrifice, and of course they couldn't. 450 prophets of Baal, they were cutting themselves and they were chanting and they were worshiping an idol that couldn't perform. And then Elijah set up his altar, doused it with water, drenched it with water, soaking wet, and then God sent down fire and consumed the sacrifice, proving that he was the one true God. And this was followed by a thunderstorm that ended the drought in Israel. Now it's time, America, that we tear down these idols. The woke agenda is done. The trans agenda is done. Don't worry about this government shutdown. Jehovah Jireh is your provider. I still believe that we're on the cusp of a revival. I still believe that this is the greatest country on earth. And I thank you again so much for listening to me today. I pray blessings over you and your family. I pray God blesses your coming in and your going out. I pray peace, power, and prosperity. And remember that you live in the greatest country on earth, and it's up to you to keep it.
This has been Commission 6-8.
I invite you into the roller coaster ride of my life in the award-winning book, For Such a Time as This, How I Navigated the World of Multifamily Real Estate to Close My First Deal, and How You Can Too. From the very first page, you'll dive into the raw emotions of ambition and resilience, facing one crushing setback after another. Yet, through each trial, I discovered new depths of determination and learned invaluable lessons in negotiation and perseverance. This isn't just a story about overcoming financial hurdles. It's about the profound personal growth that comes from navigating life's toughest challenges. It's about faith, family, and the unwavering belief that setbacks are not the end, but the beginning of something greater. For Such a Time as This, How I Navigated the World of Multifamily Real Estate to Close My First Deal, and How You Can Too, by award-winning author Randy Millette, available on Amazon.